What determines clearance? Well, this is a very involved slide, but it kind of sums up what we've been doing for the last several weeks. So, clearance is determined by blood flow to the organ and the extraction efficiency of that organ. But in order to get down to what we really want to know as far as what determines clearance, the first thing we need to know is how is it cleared? So we ask, what is the FE? What's the fraction excreted unchanged in the urine? If the fraction excreted unchanged in the urine is 0, then it's hepatic, right? And if it's 1, then it's renal, isn't it? Let's go with hepatic first. So if we know that it's hepatically cleared, then we say, what's its extraction efficiency? Is it a high extraction efficiency or is it a low extraction efficiency? So if the E is approaching 0, then it's a low E. And we know that clearance is going to be dependent upon enzyme activity and binding, don't we? And we know that the fraction that escapes that first pass effect is approximated by 1. We also know that it's going to undergo restrictive clearance, which means that only the free drug will be free for being eliminated. Only free drug will be fair game for those enzymes. So E will be limited by just the drug that is unbound. If it's not a low E, but a high E, I'm going to change my color here. So what if it's high E? Then we know clearance is dependent upon that blood flow, isn't it? And now we've got the tricky fraction that escapes first pass effect. This is why we have route dependence, right? We only see route dependence with high E drugs because of this relationship. And now we can't see this, but E is greater than your fraction unbound because this is a non-restrictively cleared drug, which makes this fraction unbound all seem as 1 to the liver. So that's what's going to determine clearance for a high E drug. Cleared by the liver is Q. And for a low E drug, it's going to be intrinsic clearance times binding, but I gave you a bunch of other stuff that you need to know as well. Okay, what about if the drug has an FE of 1 where it's a renally cleared drug? Well, then the next thing we want to ask ourselves is, what's the predominant process? Remember, we have filtration, secretion, and reabsorption. We know all drugs are going to be filtered, but which is predominant, secretion or reabsorption? Well, if the drug's filtration clearance is less than what is actually cleared by the kidneys, we know drug is being added to the tubule, which means the predominant process is secretion. So remember, this is another Michaelis-Menten situation where you have to have transporters to take the drug into the urine. So we're going to be looking for, for drug interactions, we're going to be looking for other like drugs, like acids competing with acids, or bases competing with bases. But they'd have to be secreted drugs with a lower KTS to displace our drug from its protein binding site. So for secretion, that's what we're looking for, our competing drugs. What about if the predominant process is reabsorption? And we know that because the filtration clearance is greater than what goes out into the bladder and out of the body. So the drug must be being reabsorbed back into the body. Here this is a passive process, right? So the secretion is active, but reabsorption is just passive diffusion. So we're going to look for changes in urine pH, which will change the ionic character of the drug, either enhancing or blocking reabsorption. And we're going to also look for that concentration gradient to be maintained in order to drive the reabsorption. If the concentration gradient is ruined, you're going to have a decrease in reabsorption. And if you reestablish that by getting rid of a diuretic, then it will enhance reabsorption. So that's a summary of what we've been doing the last couple of weeks, right? So what does clearance determine? We know clearance is really important because not only does it, is it a determinant of CSS average and CSS free, it's also a determinant of half-life and K. So CSS average and CSS free is going to mean that it will determine if there's a dose rate change, and half-life and K will determine if there's a dose interval change. So we can see clearances here determining CSS average, and clearances here determining our dose interval. Now, we need to dig a little bit deeper here and talk about what are the determinants of intrinsic clearance. Intrinsic clearance follows Michaelis-Menten, because intrinsic clearance, hepatic intrinsic clearance is enzyme activity. It's the number of enzymes available and the relationship between the drug and the enzyme itself. Because there's a limited number of enzymes, it also follows Michaelis-Menten, which you can see here. Vmax are the number of enzymes available, so it's the maximum rate at which you can clear the drug. So this defines the capacity of the system. Km here is the concentration where half of the Vmax or half of the enzymes are occupied. This is all about affinity, isn't it? So we'll either have an increase in the number of enzymes or a decrease in the number of enzymes, or an increase or decrease in the relationship of the affinities of two drugs that will change our intrinsic clearance. Why is intrinsic clearance important? What does it determine? Well, intrinsic clearance, hepatic clearancy, I guess I can't spell. I have to fix that slide. Intrinsic hepatic clearance determines the clearance for low extraction drugs, the hepatic clearance for low extraction drugs, because it is one of the main determinants of clearance for a low extraction drug. High extraction drugs it's not a determinant of, but it's also, for high extraction drugs, it's a determinant of FH, isn't it? So it's going to determine bioavailability for a high extraction drug, but for a low extraction drug it's going to determine clearance. So that's interesting, isn't it? Now, pharmacodynamics, which we're just learning about now. So why do we need to know pharmacodynamics? Well, it sort of pulls everything together, doesn't it? I don't know why I need to write on that. What determines the effect at a given concentration? So what determines pharmacodynamics? The things that determine pharmacodynamics are is this model of our effect being determined by the Emax times concentration all over C50 plus concentration. This should start to look very familiar. Again, it's Michaelis-Menten, isn't it? Because we have a fixed number of receptors, so our Emax is our maximum effect. Probably, if you want to think of a receptor situation, it's the number of receptors available for an effect to occur. Concentration is our concentration of our drug, so it's all about this relationship between concentration and effect. Concentration determines effect, right? So we have Emax and C50, just like we would in any Michaelis-Menten situation. C50 is the concentration where half Emax occurs. And again, you can think about half of the receptors that are needed to cause an effect being full. And it's analogous to Km. So this is the affinity and the capacity of the system and concentration. This gamma slope factor is really a mechanism to make the model fit, and does tell us something about that relationship between concentration and effect, doesn't it? About the slope, right? So this gamma Why do we care about pharmacodynamics? What do they determine? Well, in the end, they determine the target concentrations that we need for our given effects. Well, that didn't take that long. I was worried it might take long, but I moved pretty quickly, hopefully not too quickly, and you can go back and review. I hope this kind of ties everything together for you, and you understand why we've been studying all these things, and it may help you, I hope, in studying for the final as well. Thank you for your attention.